All right, welcome to day 2 of Unit 4. We're going to talk about absolutism in a couple of different places today. So we're going to split this up into a few videos. You'll also have an additional one posted on Classroom about the Palace of Versailles that you'll want to watch. It's just a fun one. You're not going to take notes on it or anything like that, but I thought you guys might like to see what the Palace of Versailles looked like. So we're going to start off with France. We're going to talk about Louis the 14th and the Sun King and Versailles, and we're going to get to all that. But before we do that, we need to get into a little bit of the background that you need to know when you are heading into this unit. So let's just jump right into your notes. So there had been some religious wars that had been going on. It was very common for a religious war to happen at this point. Remember that people have gone through the Reformation and the Catholic Church has lost power, and they continue to lose power as a result. So these religious wars in France were between the Catholic majority. Remember that France was a predominantly Catholic state, and the Huguenots. Remember that those are French Calvinists. They are Protestant, and they are the minority. So when I tell you that these were a pretty common thing, there had been 8 of these religious wars that had occurred. Okay, so let's take a look at who some of these key figures are. This guy right here is Henry IV of France, and we've already talked about him once this year. Henry IV was the first king of the Bourbon Dynasty. He came to the throne after Henry III was killed. So do you remember when we talked about the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre? This was the one where there was a week of violence that occurred at the wedding of a Catholic and a Huguenot. Well, the groom was a Huguenot, and his name was Henri de Navarre. Now, when the French king was assassinated during the week of his wedding, he actually takes over the throne. And he realized that France was about 80% Catholic at the time. So because of that, he thought that France needed to have a Catholic king. So he converts to Catholicism, and in the end, he ends up stopping the war between the Catholic and the Protestants by signing the Edict of Nantes, which you should remember guaranteed religious freedom to the Huguenots. Well, Henry IV ends up being assassinated in 1610, and his son, who was only 8 years old at the time of his father's death, he now rules France. Now, he's not literally an 8-year-old sitting on the throne of France. His mother ruled in his place until he was old enough to rule himself. Okay, so Louis the 13th is his son, and he's the 8-year-old son that's now ruling France. And we're going to talk about him more a little bit later on. But first, there is a copy of the Edict of Nantes posted on Google Classroom. Please take a few minutes to press pause here and read the Edict of Nantes. It's not very long. It's not too difficult to read. There's a section in your notes that you need to complete by reading the different edicts, okay? So go ahead and click pause now. Do that, and we will go over it in class. And remember that it's possible that a video check question or two could come from this as well. Okay, so go ahead and click pause now. Okay, so the last thing I told you about before you read the Edict of Nantes was how Henry IV of France was assassinated and his 8-year-old son came to rule France. Now, the 8-year-old wasn't really in charge. His mother ruled in his place until Louis XIII, this guy right here, was 15 years old. Then, when he was 15, he was the true king of France. Can you imagine ruling a country at your age? Well, Louis XIII was never really all that excited about it. He was actually a very weak ruler. He had no interest in ruling France at all. So what he does is he appoints this guy, Cardinal Richelieu, who had been Louis XIII's chief minister. He appointed him to kind of pretty much rule the country for him. So you need to make sure you know that a cardinal is a position of authority in the Catholic Church. Remember that Louis had pretty much given him free rein to do as he wished, talking about Cardinal Richelieu. He was a very ambitious man, and of course he had goals that he wanted to achieve. His first goal was that he wanted to create an absolute monarchy. Now you should be writing these down in the boxes to the very right of the page, where it lists Richelieu's 4 goals for France. So Richelieu firmly believed in the need for an absolute monarchy, but in order to do that, he had to have power, which leads us to his second and his third goals. So he was determined to take away power from the noble lords and give it to the middle class. Okay, that's the second goal. He also wanted to eliminate the Huguenot states and, of course, their power as well. So, because remember, he's Catholic and they're Protestant, the Huguenots, okay? So here's what he has to say about the problems facing the throne when he came to power in 1624. He said, the Protestants acted as though they shared the state with you, the nobles as if they were your equals rather than your subjects, and the governors of the provinces as though they were monarchs of their own offices. These scenarios set a bad example, one so harmful to the kingdom that even your most loyal courts were influenced by it and were driven unreasonably to build up their authority to the detriment of your own. So in other words, he's saying, look, these people, they don't really recognize you as being their real leader, and they're going off and they're doing their own sort of things. So he goes on to say, he later says, sure in the knowledge of how much a good king can accomplish when he puts his power to proper use, I dared to promise that you would soon regain control of your state. I swore to your majesty that I would spare no effort and would use whatever power it pleased you to grant me to ruin the Protestants, to break the stiff-necked pride of the aristocracy, to return all your subjects to your dutiful service, and to restore your name to the high position it deserves in foreign lands. So I know that that's a really long quote, and you're probably very glad that I didn't make you write that down. But basically what he's doing is he's called out all of the issues that he sees facing Louis XIII, who again is a very weak ruler. He's very easily influenced and basically just doesn't care about running the country all that much. But when Richelieu comes to power, and he's quite ruthless, and he's basically willing to do whatever is necessary to ensure that Louis XIII is respected and successful. So that brings us to his fourth goal. He wants to win the 30 Years' War against the Spanish Habsburgs. But what's the issue with the Habsburgs? Well, he feels that they have way too much power. So the 30 Years' War began in 1618, and yes, they actually fought for 30 years, so it ended in 1648. It began as a war between Protestants and Catholics within the Holy Roman Empire. Remember that the Peace of Augsburg had divided the Holy Roman Empire with the Protestant states in the north and the Catholic states to the south. Well, France ends up getting involved in 1632 on the side of the Protestants. Wait a minute, what? Hang on. Cardinal Richelieu. Catholic Cardinal Richelieu supported the Protestants? What? Why? Well, because he thought that the Habsburgs, again, the dynasty that's running the Holy Roman Empire, he felt that they were gaining too much power and that they needed to be defeated. So France ends up winning the war, which means that the Habsburgs were defeated. Now, Louis XIII, he ends up dying from tuberculosis in 1643 at the age of 41. But he does leave an heir, and that is Louis XIV. Okay, this spiffy-looking guy is Louis XIV. He was the king of France from the time he was 5 years old until he was 76. He's most famous for having said laissez-moi, which means I am the state. I am France. I am the government, in other words. He was nicknamed the Sun King because he stated that he would rule without a chief minister. So remember that Cardinal Richelieu, his title before he had been appointed in control was chief minister as well. So Louis XIV, he also declared himself a direct representative of God. Now you already know that that is an exact characteristic of absolutism, okay? Divine right to rule. He's stating it right there. So to show just how powerful he was, he chose the sun as his emblem to illustrate how in control he was and that basically everything revolved around him. As far as his religious affiliation goes, Louis XIV is Catholic. He does not want the Protestants to have any sort of power or control at all. So he ends up revoking the Edict of Nantes. So to revoke something basically means to take it back. If you get your driver's license revoked, that means that the DMV has taken it back from you. You no longer have the privilege of driving. And so that's just what Louis XIV did. He made it so that the Protestants could no longer have freedom of worship. Now, Louis XIV, he wanted to be an absolute ruler, but the path he took to get there, it really upset the French noble class. And there are three things in particular he does that angers them. The first thing he does is raise taxes. Of course, this upsets the nobility because they won't have as much money as they once did. Not only is he going to raise taxes, but he's also going to take power away from the noble class as well. So as if all of that weren't enough, Louis XIV really does not live a lifestyle that people are happy with either. To begin with, he lives a very extravagant, very fancy life. He had the finest of everything. And so to demonstrate his wealth and power, he built the Palace of Versailles, which had actually been a hunting lodge in his family for decades. But he gives it quite a bit of a facelift, shall we say, and you'll see that in the video. Not required, but just in case you want to see how fancy it is, thought you might want to see that. So he doesn't only build it just so that he can show off and show how powerful he is. He actually is quite terrified of the noble class. So by building Versailles, he's able to kind of keep an eye on the nobles. He keeps tabs on them. He invites them all out there and says, hey, come stay with me. And they all go, okay, I've been invited to the king. So they go. Now, the Palace of Versailles could hold 1,000 nobles in very luxurious accommodations, okay? So, needless to say, when Louis XIV dies from gangrene just days before his 77th birthday, the people of France are really not so sad about it. He was pretty unpopular at his death, and here's the main reason why. The nobles, the rich folks, they weren't paying any taxes. Zero, none, no taxes. All the people with all the money not paying any taxes. But the people who were poor, the people who did not have any money, who couldn't afford this kind of stuff, they were very heavily taxed, okay? So this isn't going to be a problem just in the immediate right now, but it also is a problem for kings who come after Louis XIV as well. And ultimately, this is what is going to lead us to the French Revolution. Okay, so before we move on, we've got to talk about the Spanish War of Succession, which lasts from 1701 until 1713. So Louis XIV is still alive during this. Okay, so we're kind of jumping back in time a little bit. So here's a little bit of a family tree, kind of. When Charles II, the guy there in the middle, when he died, he did not have an heir to the throne. And his closest relative was Louis XIV's grandson, who's Philip V of France. So what's the problem with that? Well, both France and Spain were being ruled by the Bourbon family, or the Bourbon Dynasty. And the rest of Europe got upset, and they ended up forming the Great Alliance against France and Spain. They felt that this was way too much power for one family to have throughout Europe, so they go to war. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, where Philip V became the king of Spain only and not of France. He's only the king of Spain, and he agrees to not merge with France as well. Remember that at this point, his granddaddy, Louis XIV, he is still the king of France, okay? So what are the results? What ends up happening is that England's power increases and France's power decreases. All right, so if you want, there is a video posted on Google Classroom for you to go and watch about Versailles, so you can check it out and see what it looked like. Don't forget, you also need to go back and read the Edict of Nantes if you have not already, and complete those notes as well. Your video 2, you will watch that in class. That will be all about Russia and Peter the Great, and we're going to talk about Catherine as well.